So I think the thing I want to really get across is why these tactical engagements are so often going in the Houthis' favor. Because when you look at the force densities and numbers, that isn't necessarily obvious from the outset. And I think that the thing to flag is that initially in the conflict, the Houthis were operating with essentially platoon-sized, largely family-based units that had fought together historically, had a certain amount of experience, often knew the terrain that they were operating in, and were essentially competent light infantry combatants who were able to cooperate in those small groups. And that cooperation meant that on the battlefield, they were often able to outmaneuver and defeat Yemeni government forces who were less coordinated and less tactically proficient, even when weaponry was perhaps quite comparable. But what we've seen in the last, over the last 3 years, is a very substantial shift in Houthi tactics. And that is reflective of a couple of things. Firstly, as they got bogged down in offensive operations in more complex terrain that they were less familiar with, they started taking casualties. Secondly, as they took over population areas and were able to mobilize large numbers of young fighters who didn't share those same connections or experience or tactical competence, they suddenly had a command and control issue. And thirdly, they were receiving new weaponry and equipment from the Iranians, which has shifted how they fought. And so the way that the Houthis have been fighting over the last couple of years has largely consisted of using a large number of poorly coordinated light infantry volunteers, recruits, impressed troops to flood the battle space, cause defensive positions to reveal their positions by having to suppress and engage those fighters. And then actually having the trained Houthi fighters equipped with thermal optic, essentially anti-material rifles, and other more sophisticated weaponry stood back, who are then able to knock out those defensive positions as they reveal themselves. The result being that the core Houthi fighters are not exposing themselves to very much risk. And while they do take casualties, they don't take casualties on the whole among the part of their force that is most important in terms of their ability to inflict damage on the enemy. And once they take territory, we've seen them persistently then essentially mine the surrounding area in order to impose a very, very high cost or force the adversary to concentrate in a with a level of sophistication that most of the Yemeni military units are not able to achieve in order to retake that ground without suffering unacceptable attrition. And that has meant that they've been able to hold areas with relatively small numbers of personnel. A couple of other points that I think are particularly relevant here. Firstly, they have internal lines of communication and therefore have been able to move troops around the territory that they control to concentrate against areas that they want to apply pressure against. And conversely, the Yemeni government, while it does have forces obviously surrounding those Houthi positions, has been insufficient in its coordination to be able to attack from multiple fronts. That's partly a result of diplomatic pressure, but it's also a result of a lack of cooperation between those units, which means that the Houthis are able to concentrate, whereas the Yemeni government has not been able to maneuver its forces to kind of oppose those attacks. And I think when we look at that tactical competence at the lower level, Nadwa commented on the fact that many tribal fighters will arm themselves to protect the area that is being attacked. But we would usually look at requiring a 3-to-1 advantage to retake ground in numbers. That doesn't really play out nicely when you're looking, or neatly when you're looking at irregular forces. But nevertheless, if you are looking to retake ground, and breach a minefield, I won't go into, because I know you want to publish this video, the kind of details of the shortcomings of Houthi IEDs, but it's not particularly difficult. They're fairly simplistic mines and they are defeatable, but it requires coordination at company to battle group size formation. So you're talking between 120 and about 600 people needing to operate together and use vehicles to be able to do that. And on almost all fronts, the Yemeni military is not operating at that scale. We're seeing operations coordinated at a much smaller scale than that, without the combined arms element and without the coordination or cooperation. And so we have a situation in which the Houthis are persistently able to effectively take ground, hold it, and the Yemeni government is struggling to apply pressure against them around that large frontage around the territory. And where I think this becomes particularly significant is that because of the highly localized nature of the conflict, the inability of the Yemeni government to threaten Houthi territory means that the risk of any sheikh or leader within the areas under Houthi control switching sides or altering their allegiance or position is very, very risky, because the prospect of the Yemeni military being able to support them in any way or allocate resources to support them is minimal, whereas the Houthis have been able to reposition their forces and, as Nadwa explained and mentioned previously, conduct offensive operations against tribal groups that have risen against them. And so for that reason, I think the Houthis are in a very strong position. They feel fairly stable. And even if they are taking casualties, there's perceived failure of governance, the risk of rising up against them without that happening over a large area and in a coordinated manner is simply too great. And so from a military point of view, I think the Houthis may fail to take Mareb because the airstrikes are inflicting very heavy casualties and suppressing their advance, but are nonetheless in a much more favorable position, and one in which they are developing new capabilities with Iranian support that allow them to conduct persistent strikes in depth against a lot of the territories that are stable. And I think that poses a very difficult challenge for the negotiating teams, because for foreign actors, backing the Yemeni government in that context is difficult, given that there is, on the one hand, massive political pressure not to do anything hostile to the Houthis, and at the same time, a massive asymmetry on the battlefield, or rather distributed incremental asymmetry on the battlefield that favors the Houthis almost across all fronts.